Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished and a senior professional from Pune, India, Mr. Ajit Ambekar. Ajit, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Thank you. Ajit is the founder of First Mile. So, Ajit, you've been in corporate banking, and now you've also been a corporate sales leader. Tell me a little bit about First Mile and what inspired you to transition from a corporate sales leader to an entrepreneur.
So, First Mile is the name of the business entity under which I operate.
Yeah.
And, the transition from being in the corporate world to being an entrepreneur, I think the roots of that are to do with the fact that I've always been an independent thinker all
Hmm.
my life.
Yeah.
And fortunately or unfortunately, life has given me opportunities to demonstrate that side of me at various critical junctures. So I think two things led to the transition. One is that I've always believed in doing things that I felt were right,
Hmm.
not necessarily, which I thought were right.
Hmm.
And the other part was there came a moment of clarity when I was clear of what I did not want to do.
Hmm.
And what I did not want to do was banking.
Hmm.
And if I were to go a step further,
Hmm.
I also was clear that I did not want to be part of the corporate world anymore.
Hmm.
So I think the innate independent thinker who probably always strived for independence and freedom or whatever it was,
Hmm.
coupled with this sudden realization that okay, this is not what I want to do, and I'm sure about it.
Yeah.
That's what kind of nudged me and made me get going on the entrepreneurship journey.
Amazing. And what would you say were some of the challenges uh, in this transition? Because I know I did the same. And moving from a corporate world to becoming an entrepreneur, what were some of your challenges?
Well, I must admit, much as I say that I've been an independent thinker and I've always done things that I felt were right, the quintessential Excel sheet always plays a role, right? When you take such decisions.
Correct.
I was no exception. Uh, that was the first challenge. In fact, if I'm honest, more than the financial freedom of it, it was self-doubt, which was pretty natural.
Hmm.
Uh, so self-doubt in terms of how things would pan out, and because you become so accustomed to that month-end SMS,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is into your account,
Hmm.
and for some people it's a very large figure.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first challenge, which was self-doubt, and that's probably the most important challenge.
Hmm.
But usually I've had a way around things. So at least what works for me is when I when I encounter such situations
Hmm.
where I realize that I'm trying to get out of my comfort zone, I time test it. By that, what I mean is when I realized the first time that I probably wanted to quit the corporate world, I gave it a year.
Hmm.
It was no knee-jerk reaction. I let that thought, lie somewhere at the back of my mind, and I went on. I tried to do business as usual, and that thought kind of stayed with me for a good whole year, and that's where I realized this is genuine. And then to overcome that self-doubt, I had this habit of putting a lot of things on paper, and I have my own unique way which works well for me. It may or may not work for others,
Hmm.
but I put things on paper. I kind of take a 360-degree view of things.
Hmm.
And then there's clarity. When you kind of express yourself on paper, usually for me it works. So that took care of the self-doubt. And the financial freedom, I think that was something which I started. I mean, the planning part of it was something which I started very early on in my career.
Hmm.
Uh, and that was because I always wanted that flexibility to make this kind of a decision, that freedom to make this kind of a decision if
Yeah.
that situation arose.
Yeah.
So I think an early start helped me get to that financial freedom early.
Hmm.
These two things, were the main thing that kind of
Amazing.
helped me. And I must add here,
Hmm.
the third important thing is, the willingness to give up money.
Correct.
Like I mentioned, that SMS. And I think I was blessed because I had done this earlier. I was in the Middle East for 10 years in banking, and I was in Dubai when I made the decision to come back to India, and I was probably at the peak of my career. So and I came back to India purely for family reasons. So I think I had gone through that process. I had been there, done that. That helped me make this decision easier when I quit, banking and corporate life.
Great response. And, it's a very powerful messages you're giving. I mean, you know, prepare well before you take the plunge. Have support of friends and family around you, and make sure you are willing to tighten your belt by maybe one, if not two notches.
Absolutely.
Ajit, we're going to talk about two different things today. One is how to build a robust sales strategy, because that's an area that you have a lot of expertise in. And second, we'll talk about coaching. So let's start with a few questions on robust sales strategy.
Sure.
What are some of the fundamental principles of an effective sales strategy for growth-focused businesses?
Well, I think it starts with efficient manpower planning.
Right.
Quite simply, it's crystal clarity on what kind of skills do you really want?
Mm,
Where are those skills available? How many people do you want? Where would you want to deploy them?
mm,
What is the average productivity that you expect from them? The productivity that you expect, is it realistic? Because that's something which I often notice, especially in growth focused businesses, in their zeal to really, multiply their growth.
mm.
We probably end up setting some unrealistic benchmarks. So it's very important to validate, the benchmarks you're setting for purpose and productivity. So that's where it starts. And then the next step for me, I think, would be the actual process of recruitment, which, in my view, should be given more importance than what it usually is.
Mm.
And that's because recruitment is considered to be a function as business as usual. But in the
Right.
context of sales, it
Mm.
is the most critical function,
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned, because it has to be driven. It can't just run on it can't run by default. There
Correct.
has to be accountability. There has to be accountability on both sides, HR and business, a joint accountability, and somebody has to take ownership and drive that function so that you get in the people at the time when you want them.
Mm.
Otherwise it's always a game of playing catch up, and
Yeah.
it's a lost cause,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's not just speedy recruitment, it's also smart recruitment.
Mm.
Where are your coaching centers? Where can you pick up people from?
Mm.
What's the market saying? Where are people feeling frustrated amongst your peers? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So smart and quick recruitment would probably be the second thing that comes to mind. uh, I think if I just take you across the journey in a very
Mm.
logical sequence,
Yeah.
it starts from manpower planning and then recruitment. And what's next? It's, what happens when somebody new joins. Uh, Most often, I've seen a newcomer just being handed over a SOP and said, go through it, you'll figure out, and then hit the market, you'll learn on your own.
Yeah.
And that's easier said than done. So I think that's a huge gap where not enough time is invested in very effective orientation processes.
Mm.
And even if you run through an orientation, it's probably a one size fits all for everybody. So you have somebody joining in finance, he gets through the same process. Have somebody in sales, he or she gets through the same process, which doesn't make sense.
Mm.
Because the whole point of that orientation is, how do you quickly kill the nil? Right? How do you get that person to land their first order in the shortest possible time?
Mm.
That should be the end goal of that whole orientation process. So
Mm.
unless that purpose is served, that orientation has no meaning. So there's a lot that can be done
Yeah.
in that orientation phase,
Mm.
which also I think restricts the early mortality of people quitting in the first 3 or 4 months.
Well
Right?
said. And the other aspect that I wanted to get your thought on was how important is storytelling in sales, and how can teams use this to improve conversions?
Storytelling is honestly a good skill to have, but it has to be backed with the maturity of knowing when it has to be used.
Absolutely.
It's not something which you can just use across the board. So one has to be a very good listener in order to understand whether storytelling is really needed in that situation. But if it is needed,
Mm.
then of course storytelling does help, because it paints a picture
Mm.
for people, and every person is unique in the way they visualize things.
Yeah.
So it paints a picture of the value that you're providing to the buyer, and then it
Mm.
becomes easier to connect the dots.
Mm.
So yeah, it's an important tool, is the way I would look at it,
Yeah.
but it's useful only if it is used with discretion.
Mm. And what when with the evolution of technology and AI, which is influencing a lot of modern sales strategy, how is how are sales teams using technology and data?
Okay, so when it comes to AI, I think the maximum impact has been on marketing in terms of generating quality leads, in terms of knowing the right target audiences. So that in turn has, resulted in sales teams optimizing, their bandwidth, because they are chasing prospects which have a high rate of conversion, and that high rate of conversion is backed by data or backed by patterns, right? So when it comes to AI or technology, I think that bit or that piece has been impacted more. When it comes to sales in its purest form,
Mm.
i.e., a sales conversation, which is at the heart of any transaction,
Mm.
I think it is still a very human thing.
Mm.
Uh, then you still need a person to person connect, because a buyer is going to buy only if they trust the other person and they're happy with dealing with the other person. So the salesperson, of course, has tools or data in terms of understanding how they can approach that conversation, what are the areas to research on, and all of that. But once they are in that meeting room, I think AI doesn't really help.
Mm.
It's really a people to people connect.
Correct, correct. But then, I've spoken to many people in sales, and generally I have seen people want to close a sale or close a deal. My question is, how do people balance short-term revenue goals with a long-term relationship building?
Hmm. That's a great question, and that's a reality.
Correct.
The scenario that you mentioned, that's a reality,
Correct.
and that's natural because sales is associated with numbers, with targets, with pressure, with timelines. So one tends to be a little short-sighted, if I may use the word,
Mhm.
and the temptation to quickly grab that deal and land an order against your name, so that you're on top of that leaderboard.
Yeah.
That temptation is high, I do
Mm.
admit. But
Mm.
then when you talk of balancing, I think one way you can do that is by setting expectations correctly right at the beginning of the conversation.
Mm.
When you position yourself as a strategic partner to the buyer, and not just as somebody who's going to fulfill a need at that moment of time,
Mm.
then the conversation opens up in various dimensions,
Mm.
right? Yeah, so for example, if you're in corporate training, and you've got an inquiry for, say, one particular program for middle management, let's say first time managers, the tendency to quickly close that deal is high, and that's the temptation you have. But if you try and understand what are the strategic priorities of that buyer, you may realize that they are actually working on overhauling their L&D strategy for the next 3 years, right? And once you express that you want to be a long-term partner, then suddenly a lot of other opportunities open up, and that becomes your foundation for building a long-term relationship. So you have an entry in the door, plus you have a 360-degree view of what's possibly going to happen in the future. So there's recall, there's more commitment, and that actually builds trust in the mind of the buyer.
Very well said. Well said. Thank you. So now let's talk about your other avatar as a coach. You speak about coaching and self-discovery to overcome challenges. After such an amazing corporate career and being a person who knows how to build sales strategy, what inspired you to become a professional coach, and how does this complement your sales consulting?
So when I look back, and when I try to kind of understand where my coaching journey started, I think it started when I did not realize it.
Mm.
Uh, it is probably something innate in me, and I probably started coaching when I wasn't even aware.
Mm.
It's pretty ironical. As a coach, I wasn't aware that I was a coach.
Mm.
We're talking of self-awareness here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's reality.
Mm.
Uh, so somewhere during my corporate career, I used to have a lot of conversations, and those conversations usually resulted in clarity for the other person, And when I heard them tell me that, look, Ajit, this was a great conversation and now I have clarity and thanks for spending that time with me, that used to be my aha moment.
Mm.
And somewhere I think that liking for coaching, developed. I also did a bit of it in my consulting assignments.
Mm.
And over a period of time, I realized that this is something that I really, really like doing.
Mm.
Uh, and I think the catalyst was feedback from others, who were very genuine. I mean, the feedback from them was very genuine in terms of, what, I think you can be a great coach. So all of that started playing out. And I think that's where I realized that this is worth taking up as a profession because I was really enjoying
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Well said. And given the work you've done with so many different people, what, in your view, are some of the common mental blocks a lot of sales professionals face? And how do you help them?
Yeah, this is exactly connected to the second part of your previous question,
Yeah,
that how does coaching complement, the consulting
correct.
work that I do?
Mm.
And this is directly connected to the mental blocks that we're about to discuss now. So very often, salespeople come across situations where they feel nothing is working, right? The problem statement for them is nothing is working.
Mm.
I'm working hard, I'm making 100 calls or I'm, meeting 20 people or whatever it is, but
Mm.
nothing is working.
Mm.
And they just cannot go beyond that statement,
Mm.
right? What next? If you ask them what next, they really don't know. So that's
Mm.
an abstract problem that they have, right? Here, skilling is not the solution because you don't know what area has to be skilled in.
Correct.
What is actually needed is trying to understand what is really stopping that person from doing something about it.
Mm.
So that's where a coaching conversation comes in, where the coach doesn't tell them, do this or do that because they've already tried everything. The coach enables them to discover what is really stopping them from trying something different or what is really making them feel, go through a phase of low self-esteem because that's the natural follow.
Yeah.
When people say nothing is working, they get demotivated, they feel, they have low self-esteem, and all of that can be unraveled only through a coaching conversation because
Mm.
they have to discover themselves to be clear of, what is bothering them. Yeah. A very common kind of situation that we often face or we often observe is handling the no. Like it's very common, right? How do you handle the no? Most people take the no personally. So somebody says, I'm not interested. Maybe I did something wrong. In fact, the funny side is, uh, this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a line which says, most people tend to find patterns where there aren't any. So these are situations where people start finding patterns. Oh, I
Mm.
messaged them thrice,
Yeah.
no response. Did I piss them off? Did I say something wrong?
Yeah.
So it's all inward, right? Where you are kind of being overly critical for no rhyme or reason. So
Mm.
that's where a coaching conversation comes in,
Yeah.
where at the end of it, they realize, okay, it's not as bad as it
Mm.
seems to be.
Fascinating. And just as an aside, since you talked about no, this is something I've struggled with for a long time, and I've got a new book coming out in September, which is The Power of Saying No.
Oh, wow.
So, but moving on, Ajit, we've spoken a lot about sales. I want to move to other individuals who you coach as well. And one of the things that I have often seen is that coachees struggle with stagnation. And you did mention that made 100 calls and didn't get a response, or there is burnout. Now, I'm from a very different vintage, so burnout was something which maybe we were never allowed to think about. But what kind of advice would you give to individuals who are struggling with career stagnation or burnout?
I think the starting point is to really sort of verify whether it is stagnation or whether it is frustration.
Correct.
Because very often one may tend to mix up the two.
Mm.
Because frustration is obviously something short term and it's a phase that will
Correct.
pass. But if it is stagnation, then I think it's basically a situation where you're not happy with the environment you're in and you have a desire to do something about it,
Mm.
whether it's stagnation or burnout, right? So the one thing that I would, suggest people should do is really examine how important is it for them to
Mm.
change the situation. And in coaching, there are two very powerful questions which help you do this. One is, what will happen if the status quo continues, if you do nothing about it?
Mm,
And what will not happen if you do nothing about it?
mm,
I think these two questions are extremely powerful for people to really reflect on their own
mm,
and realize how important it is for them to, to change the situation around them, to get rid of this stagnation. And once they have, once they're convinced that, this is not frustration, this is stagnation or burnout, then obviously one has to introspect in what is it that has stopped them so far in
mm,
doing anything about it.
mm,
And I think again, this is a classic case for a coaching conversation, because the point is, if you had figured out on your own
mm,
what was stopping you,
mm.
you wouldn't be stagnated in the first place.
Yeah,
So I think that's a good approach to take in such
well
situations.
said. Well said. Ajit, I have time for two more questions.
Sure.
Um, my next question is, what role does emotional intelligence play in professional success, and how can one develop this?
So emotional intelligence is has been a buzzword for a number of years now, but I would try and simplify it. It's basically understanding or being aware of your own emotions, managing your emotions, and more importantly, being aware of and managing other people's emotions whom you interact with, right? I would say that's a prerequisite for professional success, simply because no professional success can be achieved without a strong people-to-people connect. I mean, that's the fundamental of it.
Yeah,
So EI is that catalyst, which helps you develop that people-to-people connect, whether it's with your peers or superiors or any kind of stakeholders,
yeah.
right?
Mm,
How can it be developed? Well, it's a skill. There are a lot of corporate training programs specialized in training people on EI. But without getting into the formal or structured way of acquiring AI, I think a good starting point for everyone
mm,
is to practice listening.
mm.
And when I say listening, it's not listening to what is being said. It's more listening to what is not being said, the
Correct.
non-verbal portion of it.
Mm, mm,
Look for that slight which in emotion, the slight change of expression, the slight change in tonality. When you start training your mind to observe such things, automatically you develop some kind of empathy, and that I think that's the fundamental for acquiring EI as a skill.
Very well said. And my last question to you, and I know this is probably applicable to everyone who you work with, I'm sure for yourself as well, and for me. How can professionals build a strong personal brand to enhance their career growth?
Hmm. Great question. So, what's a personal brand? I mean, let me start with that. Uh, I think a personal brand for me fundamentally is something that you can embody
Hmm,
and not something that you just create
correct.
just to look good,
Correct.
right? Uh, don't fake it to make it. And that's not
Correct.
going to last.
Correct.
And how do you build your brand? I don't think you build it. I think it gets built on its own
Hmm,
as long as you're authentic
yeah.
in your thoughts and in your actions. So
Hmm,
what is necessary is at a grassroots level is for you to connect with your own core values, with your
hmm,
own belief system. Who do you represent as an
correct.
individual?
Hmm,
And then align your thoughts and actions with that. And then automatically behind the scenes, a brand gets built, which you can embody. And that's a personal strong brand for me.
hmm,
I mean, a strong personal brand for me,
correct.
because
Correct.
that is something that will sustain.
Correct. Well said. And on that note, Ajit, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. I think we covered some very interesting ground on sales. You talked about some of the fundamental principles. You spoke about how important storytelling is. We also talked about technology and AI and data influencing sales strategy. Then we spoke a little bit about coaching. We spoke about some of the common mental blocks sales professionals face. You also gave us some very interesting pointers on career stagnation and burnout. You gave us some thoughts on emotional intelligence and how important it is. And finally, you told us about personal branding. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Pleasure is mine, Ashutosh. It's been a very engaging and delightful conversation. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for having me over.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.